Hey guys, this is Will with LearnChess101.com, and we're going to go over an interesting game today. Something pretty interesting happened on about the 23rd move, where it looked like I had a queen trapped, and when you watch the game, you'll see what happened. So let's get to it. So we start off. I'm white color. My opponent is dark. So coming out, we're just bringing out our pawns. We exchange pawns right there. And this is interesting here. I want to back up. So my opponent moves the pawn to place in a position to capture my knight. And instead of moving my knight, I've moved mine out to c3 to be in position to capture the queen. So now my opponent had to move their queen. And now at this point, I go in, I capture their pawn, and they are not able to capture me in return because of their positioning. So again, just to back up, it's always an interesting thing to do. You don't always want to be reactive. You immediately see, for example, the pawns here. You don't always have to just move your knight. Read the board and see what options you have. So let's get back to here. Okay, so my opponent brings out the bishop. We're just kind of bringing out our pieces here, getting the board set up. Opponent castles. And moving our pieces around, getting my pawns out. And I always like to do this when I have a bishop or any piece for that matter sitting there. I always want to bring my pawn out to the point that they either have to capture the knight or get out of there. Either way, I don't like them sitting around, especially when the queen on b6 has the position to put themselves right there where my king is. They take my knight, and I capture the bishop in return. And you can sort of see there, it looks like possibly maybe they're trying to make the attack right here at f2. You can see where my mouse is. So again, now I castle just to remove that out of there. And again, you always want to castle as soon as you can, so long as it's a good time to do it in the game. And I put my bishop in position to get the queen. And we exchange pawns. Then I capture their bishop. And this is interesting right here is that they have the option, if they wanted to capture my queen, and then in return I would capture their queen, and we just do a big exchange off. Instead they don't. I get my queen out of there. The rook's out. I move my knight in position to capture the queen. Again, what I'm looking here is maybe my opponent will make a mistake and move the queen to somewhere where it's in position to be captured. They don't do that, just move it back to protect the king. And now I move my queen in position to capture this pawn right here. It's not a big capture, but it can make a really big difference. Moves the knight out to be in position to capture my queen, and I take the pawn. And this is where it's going to start to get interesting. We're on move 20, as I said. Move 23 is where it got kind of interesting. Now my opponent's moving their knight a little bit closer around my king's area. I move the rook to protect the pawn. Again, you always want to make sure your pieces are protected, even if it's just a pawn. That can make a huge difference at the end of the game. And on top of that, I'm also hoping potentially I can get this pawn out of the way, and you can see my opponent's queen is covering the king. And if I can get somehow this pawn out of here, then I'm positioned to capture the queen with my rook. So my opponent moves the rook out, so at this point, getting rid of the pawn won't make too much of a difference. Either way, I'm moving the pawn down the board. Opponent moves the king. And now, of course, my pawn is in a position to capture the rook. So they move the rook. Now, this is where it's interesting. This is, again, move 20. And so I want you to take a look and kind of look over the chessboard and think about what you would do here. So if you look, I can't move here. I can't move there. And if I capture, I'll get captured by the rook or the queen. And if I capture the rook, I'll lose my queen to the pawn. So I'm losing my queen to a rook. Of course, I can't move the queen here either. Again, just capture my queen without losing her and, having an unfair trade-off with the rook. I move the pawn up. When it has a couple of options. They could just move the king out of the way. Then, of course, I can move my pawn there. It can get a little sloppy. Instead, what they choose to do is they capture my pawn with theirs. and then I capture, and they can't even capture my queen. So just to back up again, what my opponent originally thought was them capturing my queen, as you'll see, turned into me just capturing my opponent, not losing any pieces in return. Just be mindful of everything on the board. This can also go the other way. You don't want to be the opponent who thinks you have someone caught and then they get their way out of it. I mean, obviously, you can't always anticipate these things, but this is why it's so great to read the board beforehand and take a little bit of time before you choose what moves you want to do. Opponent moves out the rook, put the king in check, and now moving my knight in. Potentially capture the rook. I'm wondering if maybe they miss it. They don't. They move the rook. And at this point, I move my queen there. I have a major advantage at this point in the game. I'm up a rook, and more times than not, when I'm in that position, I can win the game. So at this point, I want to just get my opponent's queen out of the game just so they don't have any chance of perhaps making any type of comeback. So they take my queen. I take theirs. And at this point now, you'll see I've got the rook, two rooks, a knight, and a bishop, and they've got a rook and two knights. So I've got the advantage of having an extra rook, and I also have one extra pawn right here who I could potentially move down the board. They move their knight out there. I take another pawn. Again, now building up my lead. They're bringing their knights out. And again, now I'm bringing down one to potentially upgrade to a queen. And they move the rook to capture it. Again, I capture the knight. At this point, I just want to get rid of their pieces. Have the advantage. It's just no reason not to do this at this point. And again, just keep moving the pawn down. So now at this point, my opponent is just trying to prevent my pawn from becoming a queen. Of course, the pawn right now is protected by my rook. And again, I'm getting ready to capture the knight. They move the knight out of there. And they just quit the game because I was about to take their knight. At that point, it would have been essentially their rook against my two rooks and bishop. So they ended up resigning. But again, the big thing to learn again was just that one part with the queen where it looked like the queen was trapped. I was going to be losing her, and instead they ended up losing their rook. So I hope you guys learned something from that. Again, the big thing to take away is just to read the board and take your time before you make any moves. You know, don't always think you have someone captured, and don't always assume that you're in a position to be captured. You know, there's sometimes many ways out if you really take the time to look around. So again, I want to thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And again, this is LearnChess101.com.